Welcome to the Huntington Way Show, where we help parents navigate the educational maze. I'm your host, Yvonne Strachan, author and founder of inspirationalhomeschooling.com. And I am here speaking with Israel Wayne. He serves on the Michigan State Homeschool Organization. He is also founder of FamilyRenewal.org and the author of several books, including Education, Does God Have an Opinion? I want to thank our sponsors, the Huntington Learning Center and Inspirational Homeschooling, for bringing this show to you. Our topic today is apologetics and a biblical worldview in education. You're listening on Power Talk 1040 AM, 98.5 FM, and 95.7 FM. Please like and subscribe to Power Talk 1040 on YouTube. Welcome to the show, Israel.
Thank you. It's a blessing to be with you.
Blessing to have you. So, how has thinking on education morphed since the American Civil War?
Well, prior to the Civil War, it was assumed that parents would be primarily responsible for the child's education. In most cases, parents taught their own children. And in other cases, they formed groups that we would now call homeschool co-ops, where parents would share teaching duties, or sometimes they would hire one teacher or tutor. But the curriculum was usually customized, curriculum chosen by the parents. It was paid for by the parents. The teacher or tutor was someone who would kind of rotate around in different homes. In fact, if you read the Laura Ingalls Wilder books, you'll see how she talks about as a school teacher, how she would go from one family to another and spend like a month in each home. That was part of her compensation, was a stipend plus room and board. And yet the parents were very much in charge of the education. But then there's a guy named Horace Mann in Massachusetts who started something called compulsory attendance laws that forced all children to have to go to tax-funded, government-controlled schools. And by 1900, that really became the standard around the United States, that all children had to go to a government school, and they had a monopoly on that until about 1925, when the Catholics were able to seek an exemption from compulsory attendance laws through a Supreme Court case called Pierce versus Society of Sisters. And then it wasn't until 1972 that there was a case called Wisconsin versus Yoder, where the Amish were also given an exemption and were able to start their own parochial schools. And so in the 1970s, there was an explosion of private schools, most of them Christian schools. And then around 1983, about 26 different state homeschool associations and the Homeschool Legal Defense Association were founded, and the modern day homeschooling movement began. And so we really have kind of gone full circle to where many parents now are interested in taking back responsibility for their child's education. And many people think that this homeschooling thing is a very new experimental phenomenon, but it's really what all parents have done for all time throughout human history until really very recently. And it really was the writings predominantly of Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto, where he said we need to have a free system of public schools. That was the 10th plank of the Communist Manifesto, and it really has largely been the influence of Karl Marx and Marxism across Eastern Europe, and then moving to the United States and other places where this concept of government-controlled schools has come into vogue. So it really is the new kid on the block, honestly, in terms of human history, this concept that we'll send our children away to people we don't know to be educated by the government. That's a really new and radical experimental process that, from my personal viewpoint, is something that we should have never gone down that path in the first place. But I think we have enough evidence now to show that it's not how children learn best. It's not best for their emotional well-being, that really parents know what's best for their children. And we need to return education back to parents where it rightfully belongs.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like way back, there was more Christians. And so we were following more of the biblical principle in raising our children. And since the institution of schooling has happened, we've walked more and more away from that. And we are seeing the impact of that on our kids.
Well, I agree with that. I think even more directly than that, when you read the writings of the founders of the government school system, people like Horace Mann, John Dewey, who was a president of the NEA, one of the early presidents, teachers at Columbia University. He was an atheist, a socialist, God hater. They said that the reason that they wanted to create government schools was to destroy the influence of Christianity in America. Karl Marx said it was to destroy the family, said that in the Communist Manifesto, and then also to use it as a platform to teach economic socialism. So, I mean, when you think about those being the intended stated goals of what we call public schools, which are, I think it's a misnomer. I don't call them public schools because they're controlled by the government, they're funded by the government, they're regulated by the government, so they really are government schools. But when we look at the purposes for it being founded, to basically destroy the free market enterprise, to destroy the family, and to destroy the influence of Christianity in the United States, a lot of people say the public schools are broken and they need fixed. Well, they're actually doing exactly what the founders created them to do. And they've been more successful than the founders could have ever dreamed. So, in that respect, yeah, the government schools have been phenomenally successful at achieving the purposes for which the founders created them.
Yeah, really, if you want to change a society, get a hold of the kids and educate them, right?
Well, it's what Stalin did. It's what Hitler did. It's what Mao Zedong did. It's what really every tyrannical, totalitarian despot has done. In fact, John Dewey went to Russia in 1928, saw what the Soviets were doing, saw what Stalin was doing, and came back praising the Soviet system and said, we need to pattern our American government schools after the Soviet schools. He wrote an essay about that in 1929. So, yeah, there's definitely been a connection, I think, for a long time of people realizing the power of social engineering that can happen in the classroom, and that aspect of, the what Lincoln said, about how the person who influences the schoolroom in one generation will influence society in the next. I think that's definitely been something that's been proven time and again through these brilliant but evil social engineers who wanted to change the future of the world using the classroom to do it, and they've shown how effective it can be.
Right. And so a lot of parents, we're pulling our kids home to make an impact, to make a difference. And that's great. But the worldview is going to make a difference in even what we do with our kids. Can you speak to that? What are the different worldviews? Why are they important?
Yeah, I've never really just recommended home education in a vacuum. I mean, to me, there's obviously the location of where a child learns has bearing. I mean, I'll just throw this out there that in that respect, one of the things that John Dewey was motivated to do was to create a classroom of 30 to 40 students, all the same age, to move away from the one-room schoolhouse of the Laura Ingalls days to the more institutional classroom, because he believed it would create peer dependency, and that peer dependency, just from the classroom structure, would break the allegiance of children from their parents and make them more easy to manipulate or maneuver as a group. And so there are some things that just in terms of form and methodology are really matter. But in terms of the content side of it, I mean, we could bring our children home and teach them a Marxist, socialist, anti-American, anti-Christian education at home, and I don't feel like we've achieved much, right? So my view has always been that the form or the methodology needs to change, but the content needs to change as well. We need to make sure we're not teaching revisionist history, and that we're not tearing down the foundations of our constitutional republic, and teaching postmodernism, which teaches that there are no absolutes. And we need to get back to the basics that made America great for many generations, and we've just slowly removed those things. We've removed the influence of God. We've removed the influence of national sovereignty. We've removed the concept of the rule of law. That basically what makes something right is not power, but they are transcendent values that are true for all people in all places at all times. And so the American system of rule of law was that there's no person that's above the law. Every single person is underneath, subservient to this moral law. And our founders said that we found that moral law in the nature of God, as expressed in the Ten Commandments and expressed in the Bible. So yeah, I think there's a lot that we have to recover, and for us as parents, in home education in particular, we have the opportunity to return to some of those transcendent values that really made America the greatest nation in the world for many generations.
Yeah, and I think our forefathers had that because what they would do is they placed their foundations on the Bible. And so they really realized that God puts people into authority, and then they take that to heart, like, I am a servant. When you're in
Absolutely.
authority, you're a servant. And so that's a really big point there. So let's take a break. And when we come back, we'll continue our conversation. Welcome back to the Huntington Way Show. You're listening on Power Talk 1040 AM, 98.5 FM, and 95.7 FM. Please like and subscribe to Power Talk 1040 on YouTube. I'm your host, Yvonne Strachan, and I'm speaking with Israel Wayne. We're talking about apologetics and a biblical worldview in education. So, Israel, often a child's sense of self-worth is actually determined by the most important people in their life. And I know you've talked about this before in our other episode. And you've talked about peers being an immense influence and how that can be impactful, especially in public schools. And so I want to just talk about a few things here. First of all, I'm thinking about that impact and those peers and the socialization. And that's one of those things that everybody talks about homeschooling. They're always worried about socialization. So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
I'll often say that there's three teachers in any school. There's the person who stands up front and says that they're a teacher. There's the textbook, which is also a teacher. Then there's the teacher that's actually going to influence your child, and that's the peer group. And so when you put a child into a classroom with 30 to 40 students their own age, research has demonstrated that the vast majority of those students will become peer dependent in 1 year of simply being in a classroom. They will begin to care more about the values and opinions of their friends than the values of their parents. They will want to please their peers more than they want to please their parents. And so it really is sad that so many parents delegate and just give away the influence that they could have as parents. And they do it to not just to peers, but they do it to screens, to video games, to movies, to music. The average young person, if you take a pie chart of the day, 24 hours, they spend about 7.5 hours a day in school, 7.5 hours a day in multimedia screen time. That's 15 hours a day. As I said, U.S. government says the average mom gets an hour, average dad gets 29 minutes. So parents are getting very little influence in the lives of their children. And we want to make sure as parents that we find ways to buy back that time so that we really can have influence in their lives.
Mm. Yeah, what an important point. And if those kids are in school, I just think about that, you're looking at more than 10,000 hours away from you, and so we need to carefully consider the peers and the extracurricular activities and things like that are with them.
Yeah, for sure.
So
In
how
fact,
do you go
let me
ahead?
jump in on that. In fact, from kindergarten through 12th grade, you're looking at 10 to 25,000 hours when you count school time plus screen time. You're
Mm,
looking at, for most teenagers, about 25,000 hours of really anti-Christian indoctrination for most of them before they finish high school. And that's why about 70% of all church youth reject Christianity before they finish high school and do not embrace the values of their parents because they weren't raised with the values of their parents. They were raised by the values of pop culture and their peer group.
mm, yeah, that that sure is a big point. Mm. So when you look at socialization for your family, how do you and Brooke choose those activities?
Well, we have four questions that we ask when opportunities come up. We ask the question, is this opportunity or this social engagement, is this pro-spiritual? Will this help
Mhm.
them to love God more? Will it help them to become stronger in their faith? Or is there potential this would tear down their faith in some way? We ask, is this pro-family? Is this something that our whole family can do together and participate in? Or is this just our child being sectioned off away from the family, becoming, more independent from the family at a young age? And then we also ask, is it pro-educational? Like, does this merely have an entertainment value, or can they learn from this? And then Finally, is it pro-relational? We do want our children to have friends and we want them to have positive relationships with other people, but is this going to be the right kind of relationships? In a classroom, you don't get to choose. You just get thrown in there with 30 or 40 other students that you don't have anything in common with, just randomly, like they live in your area. So you spend most of your childhood with them by force. We want them to be able to spend time in positive activities with young people that we know and that we know who they are, we know their families, we know their parents, and in a more of a family context than just a one-on-one child activity. So I talk about some of those things in my book, Education, Does God Have an Opinion? I also have another book called Answers for Homeschooling, the top 25 questions critics ask. And I go through socialization in both books. I address it from different angles, but I have a chapter on socialization in each one of those books because it's a very important topic.
Hmm. Yeah, so it's not just them being with their peers, it's how are they impacted and what choices are they making? And then the other thing is, do us parents, if they're gone from us, we don't even know how they're impacted until sometimes later or sometimes never. And if you don't know what's going on, you can't address it. So there's that point as well. And going back to what you had said earlier about them having 10 to 25,000 hours away from you, and we can't insert or undo the anti-biblical worldview in 29 minutes or 1 hour. There's just no possible way to undo that.
For sure. And there's even physical harm that's done to our children. In fact, Psychology Today magazine in May of this last year, 2023, they said that 11.7% of all students in public schools experience sexual harassment at the hands of school employees. And that
Wow.
doesn't even count their peers or students in the class, and there's plenty of that. So literally over 1 out of 10 students are involved in some form of sexual abuse before they finish high school. And most parents, they don't think about that. They don't realize that there's real risks involved in just turning your children over to people that you don't know. So many people say, oh, well, they'll be kept safe because they're mandated reporters. Well, unfortunately, sexual abuse is happening at the hands of mandated reporters who, rather than keeping the child safe, are exploiting them. So, not to live in fear, but I think as parents, we need to realize it's a new era, it's a new day. Our children's minds are being corrupted with all of this new gender ideology that's being pushed on them, Marxism, lots of different forces that are totally different than the way that many of us were raised. And we don't live in Mayberry anymore. It's a new world, and parents need to be very proactive in knowing who is influencing their child and what kind of environments their children are being put in, even for their own physical safety.
Hmm. And I think about how us as adults sometimes can be so confused by everything that's going on around us, and sometimes even don't know how to respond. And if we have a hard time, how can we expect our kids to be able to respond so well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we need to make sure that our children are raised in an environment where they're first of all safe, but that we navigate them through these very difficult issues in our current era.
Hmm. And the Bible has a lot to say about how to address all of these issues.
It really does. It
So,
puts the responsibility on us as parents. It doesn't tell us, send your children to the government, let the government raise them. It doesn't even say, send your children to the church and let the church raise them. It tells us that it's our job and we need to take that seriously as parents.
yeah, and that makes sense. So you have an ideology that you like to work through with your kids, and I was reading about that in your book, The Education, Does God Have an Opinion? And so you mentioned the precept, the principle, the person, and the practice. Can you explain that more to me?
Yeah, it's a little bit difficult to unpack, but it's actually a concept I got from a book I read when I was 17 years old by Josh McDowell. It was just talking about how when God gives laws or precepts in the Bible, like the Ten Commandments, there's a principle behind it. There's a reason for it. So when God says don't kill or don't commit adultery or don't steal, he's not just giving those as rules because he hates us and doesn't want us to have any fun. He understands what's best for us as people and what's best for society. So there's a principle behind those, and that the laws that God makes are consistent with his nature, character, and personality. So when we see a precept, which is a law, we ask ourselves, what's the principle or the purpose behind it? And then that reveals something to us about the person who made the precept and the principle. So when we see that God says, do not kill, do not murder, that's because God is life. And so life is consistent with who God is, and he creates that which is consistent with life. When he tells us to not bear false witness, that's because God is truth. And so these laws teach us about his character, personality. And then as parents, we have the opportunity to put that into practice and to model in front of our children these principles that we learn based on the precepts that are given in God's nature and character and personality. So in my book, Education, Does God Have an Opinion? I apply that to different academic disciplines. And I ask, what does mathematics teach us about the nature and character of God? Or what does language or science or history or any of the academic subjects, what do they teach us about God? And how can we teach our children to know God better through the academic subjects rather than just, here, you need to learn this so you can get a job and make money? We actually can learn what God is like to a great extent from studying these academic disciplines.
Yeah, that's great. So I know you mentioned some of these different academic disciplines that are important: logic, math, science, philosophy. Really, all of them talk about God. And so I would assume that you're probably not telling people to not study these, that these things are very important and they show us who God is.
Yeah, and to do them from a biblical worldview is not just to throw Bible verses in, but it's to
Mhm.
realize, for example, like we didn't as humans create logic. Logic was embedded into the universe and we discovered it. We didn't create mathematics. We discovered
Mhm.
mathematics. We didn't create music. We discovered music. And so all of these things are inherent within the universe, within the created order, because God made them and he put them into the world to reflect his personality so that we could see what he's like. And so as we have discovered these things and then systematized them and taught them and made them more perceptible so that we can understand them, we've been able to harness these laws of the universe and use them. We didn't create physics. Physics was here. We didn't create gravity. We didn't create motion. We didn't create thermodynamics. All these things were here in the universe. We discovered them, but they each teach us something about God's nature and character. And I think that's a unique aspect of my book, Education, Does God Have an Opinion? That I really talk about how each one of these things reveals aspects of God's nature, and they tell us who God is and what he's like based on the creation.
Well, that's great. And I did really enjoy your book. This is a great book for everybody to read. So I thank you for writing this. And can you just share where people can find you?
We would encourage people to purchase our books from our website, which is familyrenewal.org. And then /store will take you to the place where you can buy them. And you can just look up books that I've written. I've written quite a few and look through them. Again, familyrenewal.org/store. And we will personally sign any books of ours, the books that I've written that you purchase from our website. We encourage you to do that. It's a great way for you to support our organization and also a way to get a personalized signed copy, which Amazon won't provide for you. So appreciate you going to familyrenewal.org.
Yeah, thank you so much, Israel, for sharing all this great information, not just through the books, but also through all your speaking that you do. And I encourage our listeners to please support his mission through the familyrenewal.org, because that will also enable them to just consider and continue to pour into families. This has been Yvonne Strachan, today's host on the Huntington Way Show, where we support you in educating your kids. Thank you for joining us.